I was walking down Elm Avenue in the middle of a quiet afternoon, carrying everything I owned from that hospital. Then the sky cracked open with the thunder of rotor blades. 3 black helicopters descended onto the empty field beside the road. Men in tactical gear hit the ground running, and the first one to reach me grabbed my arm and shouted, "Are you Dr. Merrick? We need you right now." I had been a trauma surgeon for many years. In that time, I had learned that hospitals run on 2 things: skill and nerve. Skill to do what the textbooks said was impossible. Nerve to do it anyway when the monitor was screaming and the room had gone quiet. I had both, and for a long time that was enough. Riverside General had been my hospital in every way that mattered. Not because I owned it, but because I had bled for it, stayed late for it, and made decisions inside its walls that no committee would have approved and no administrator would have understood. I was not a complicated man. I had been married once, and that had ended the way most things end, when one person gives everything to a job and the other person finally grows tired of waiting. There was no bitterness about it now, just a clean, empty flat on Harrington Street and a habit of arriving at the hospital before sunrise because there was nothing at home worth staying for. My whole life had narrowed itself down to one corridor, one operating theater, one simple rule. If a person was still breathing when they came through that door, my job was to make sure they kept breathing. Everything else was noise. For many years, that rule had been enough. Then Lydia Beaumont arrived. She came in one spring morning, and by noon she had already rearranged the executive floor and scheduled meetings with every department head. I met her a few days later. I sat across from her in a glass-walled office that still smelled of fresh paint, and within 5 minutes I understood exactly what kind of director she was going to be. She spoke in numbers: reimbursement rates, average procedure costs, length of stay, metrics, revenue per patient ratios. She had a way of delivering those numbers that made them sound like facts of nature, like gravity, like something no reasonable person would argue with. I was not always a reasonable person. I asked her what she planned to do about the trauma cases that did not fit neatly into a reimbursement category: complex polytrauma, rare internal injuries, the kind of cases that cost 3 times the standard rate and took 10 times the surgical hours. Lydia looked at me across the desk with a calm that I would come to recognize as her default setting and told me that every case would be evaluated on a cost-benefit basis going forward. Pre-authorization would be required for high-risk, high-cost interventions. The hospital had to operate as a sustainable institution. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the steering wheel. Over the following months, the conflict between us became a slow-moving landslide. It never exploded all at once. It built in layers. A case refused here, a form denied there, a meeting where I pushed back and Lydia listened with perfect patience and then did exactly what she had already decided to do. There was a 43-year-old man with a ruptured hepatic artery who needed emergency intervention that the system had flagged as non-standard. I performed it anyway. Lydia called me in the next morning and told me that what I had done had bypassed every protocol she had put in place. I told her the man would have been dead by morning if I had waited for authorization. She told me that was not the point. I told her that to me it was the only point. That conversation became the template for every conversation that followed. The staff noticed, the nurses, the residents, the anesthetists who had worked alongside me for years. They all felt the line being drawn down the center of the hospital. On one side, the way things had always been done. On the other, the way Lydia Beaumont needed them to be done. Some people crossed the line quietly and without fanfare because they had bills and contracts and futures to protect. I did not cross it. I stood exactly where I had always stood and dared the institution to move me. It moved me one afternoon. Lydia's assistant called me to the director's office. I went without asking why, because I already knew. I had known for weeks, the way you know a storm is coming because the air changes before the clouds do. The office was quiet when I arrived. Lydia was seated at her desk with a single folder open in front of her, and she did not offer me a seat right away. When she did, she began speaking in the same measured tone she always used, the tone that had no room in it for argument or appeal. She told me that after a full review of my conduct over the past several months, the hospital had made the decision to end my employment effective immediately. She used the word conduct twice. She said that I had demonstrated a consistent pattern of disregarding institutional protocols, that I had created liability exposure on multiple occasions, and that the culture I embodied was fundamentally incompatible with the direction the hospital needed to go. She slid a document across the desk, a termination agreement already prepared with a line at the bottom waiting for my signature. I looked at the paper for a long moment. Then I looked at her. "Many years," I said. "I understand this is difficult," Lydia replied. I did not sign anything. I stood up, walked to my locker, packed the items from my desk into a cardboard box, a stethoscope, a worn copy of a surgical reference text I had carried since residency, a photograph from a departmental event years ago, and I walked out through the main entrance without saying goodbye to anyone because I did not trust myself to say the right things. The afternoon was cold and clear. Elm Avenue ran alongside the hospital campus for about 3 blocks before it opened up into a wider road with a strip of empty field on the right side. I walked it slowly, the box under one arm, not thinking about anything in particular and thinking about everything at once. I had made my first solo trauma repair in that building. I had pulled people back from the edge in that building. I had been more myself inside those walls than anywhere else in my life. And now I was carrying it all in a cardboard box under a pale sky, heading nowhere. I heard the helicopters before I saw them. The sound came from the south, a deep, rhythmic percussion that grew fast, too fast for anything civilian. I turned and looked up just as 3 black helicopters cleared the tree line and descended in tight formation onto the empty field beside the road. The rotor wash hit me like a wall, scattering leaves and flattening the dry grass in wide circles. I stepped back automatically, instinct overriding confusion. Before the rotors had even fully slowed, doors were sliding open. Men in dark tactical clothing hit the ground and moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that did not belong in a quiet afternoon on a street in this part of London. One of them was already coming straight toward me, covering the ground between us in long, deliberate strides. He was broad across the shoulders, maybe mid-40s, with close-cropped grey hair and the expression of someone who had not slept recently and was operating entirely on urgency. He reached me and grabbed my arm, not roughly, but with zero ambiguity about who was in charge of the next 30 seconds. "Are you Dr. Duncan Merrick?" the man asked. I looked at the grip on my arm, then at the man's face. "I am." "Alistair Kane," the man said, as if that explained anything. "I work for Sir Victor Langford. You know the name." I knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Sir Victor Langford had built a logistics and infrastructure empire over the past 3 decades that had reshaped half the regional economy. His name was on 2 hospital wings in neighboring counties, a research foundation, and about a dozen other things that required more money than most people could imagine. "Langford was in a vehicle accident a short time earlier," Alistair said, already moving, already steering me toward the nearest helicopter without quite waiting for an answer. "Internal trauma. Our medical team stabilized him on site, but he needs surgery. Our people tell us it is a hepatic and diaphragmatic injury with vascular involvement, and that there are maybe 4 surgeons in the country who have performed this specific repair under emergency conditions." I did not move toward the helicopter yet. "Then call one of the other 3. "We did." Alistair met my eyes directly. 2 are currently in surgery, 1 is abroad. You are here. You are the one who is here." The man's voice did not waver, but something in it acknowledged what it was asking. "Dr. Merrick, I know what happened this afternoon. I know you just walked out of that hospital, and I'm standing here anyway asking you." The rotors were still spinning. The field smelled of cut grass and jet fuel. I looked down at the cardboard box in my arms, everything that was left of many years. And then I looked at the helicopter, and then I looked back at Alistair Kane's face. There was no calculation in what happened next. I did not weigh my anger against my conscience or my pride against my training. It was not that complicated. It had never been that complicated. A man was bleeding out somewhere, and I was a trauma surgeon. That was the whole equation. I set the cardboard box down on the ground beside the road. "Tell me everything you know about the injury on the way," I said, and walked toward the helicopter. The helicopter lifted before I had fully buckled in. Alistair Kane sat across from me with a tablet already open. During the short flight, he spoke without stopping, laying out everything their medical team had documented at the scene. Vehicle collision on a rural road, high-speed impact on the driver's side. Langford had been conscious at first, then deteriorated fast. The field team had got 2 large-bore IVs in, pushed fluids, and kept him stable enough to transport. The imaging done at the site, portable ultrasound, limited but functional, showed free fluid in the abdomen, and what their physician suspected was a combined hepatic laceration and diaphragmatic tear with involvement of at least one major vessel. I listened without interrupting. I asked 2 questions. The first was about blood pressure trends since the accident. Alistair read the numbers from the tablet, and I did not like what I heard. A slow but consistent decline that the fluids were only partially correcting, which meant the bleeding had not stopped. The second question was about what surgical resources would be available at the facility. Alistair told me that Langford maintained a private medical setup at his estate in the Surrey countryside, a room that had been built to full surgical suite specifications after a health scare several years ago. Staff on retainer, equipment up to date, anaesthetist already on site. I looked out of the window at the landscape moving beneath us and said nothing more for the rest of the flight. The estate came into view as the sun was dropping toward the tree line, a large property set back from a private road, the main house visible in the distance, but the helicopter descending toward a secondary structure closer to the landing pad. 2 people in scrubs were already waiting outside when the rotor slowed. Alistair moved quickly, and I moved with him, and within minutes of landing, I was inside and washing my hands at a scrub sink that was better equipped than half the hospitals I had rotated through during my residency. The anaesthetist was a woman named Dr. Fiona Clark, composed and efficient with the kind of quiet competence I recognized immediately as someone who had worked high-pressure cases before. She gave me a fast briefing on Langford's current status as I gowned up. Blood pressure was holding at the low end of acceptable, heart rate elevated. 2 units of packed red cells already running. The portable CT, a compact machine that should not have existed outside a major medical center, but apparently did when you had Sir Victor Langford's resources, had confirmed what the ultrasound had suggested. A grade 4 hepatic laceration, a posterior diaphragmatic tear, and what appeared to be involvement of the right hepatic vein. I read the images myself. I stood at the monitor for a long moment, not moving, taking in every slice of the scan with the focused attention of someone translating a language they had spent their entire career learning. When I turned away from the screen, my expression had not changed, but something behind my eyes had recalibrated. "This is more complex than what your team described in the field," I said to Fiona. "The venous involvement changes the approach. I need to know the exact volume of crystalloid they pushed before the blood products, and I need you to be prepared for significant intraoperative hemorrhage." Fiona had the numbers ready. She had clearly already been thinking about the hemorrhage. "Understood," she said. "What is your plan?" "We control the hepatic bleeding first. Pack and assess the diaphragm. If the vein is lacerated rather than transected, we repair. If not, we manage and stabilize until he can be transferred to a full trauma center for definitive care." I looked at the 2 scrub technicians standing ready on the other side of the room. "Everyone clear on what we are doing?" They were. I went in. The first part of the operation went the way I had planned. I worked with the kind of economy that came from having done this long enough that my hands knew the moves before my mind had finished issuing the instructions. The hepatic laceration was severe. The imaging had not understated that, but the bleeding was controllable with the right technique and the right pressure. I worked steadily, calling for instruments in a low, even voice, keeping the rhythm of the room calm because a calm room made fewer mistakes. Fiona kept Langford's pressure in a range I could work with. The technicians were good. For a private facility assembled under emergency conditions, the setup was better than it had any right to be. Then I reached the diaphragmatic tear. What the CT had shown as a clean posterior defect was, in direct view, something considerably worse. The tear extended further laterally than the imaging had captured, and at its edge, right at the margin where the diaphragm met the vascular structures above, there was hemorrhage that had been partially tamponaded by surrounding tissue. The moment my instrument disturbed that margin, the tamponade released. "Pressure drop," Fiona said, her voice controlled but immediate. "Systolic falling, 88. I did not look up. Suction. I need a clear field now. The next several minutes compressed into the particular kind of time that only exists inside an operating theater when something has gone wrong, and every second is a decision. The bleeding was significant, not catastrophic yet, but moving in that direction with purpose. The right hepatic vein was involved exactly as I had feared, and the access was complicated by the position of the tear and the swelling in the surrounding tissue. I called for a different retractor. I repositioned. I made a judgment call about the angle of approach that was not in any textbook because the situation on the table was not in any textbook. Systolic at 79, Fiona reported. One of the scrub technicians, a younger man named Callum, who had been steady all along, shifted his weight and said too quietly for it to be a statement and too loudly for it to be just a thought. We might need to consider. We are not stopping, I said, not harshly, just with complete finality. Push the second unit faster. Fiona, I need his pressure back above 90, and I need 3 minutes working on it. Fiona said nothing. The room held that particular quality of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound, monitors beeping, instruments moving, the ventilator cycling, and everything to do with the absence of certainty. Everyone in that room was doing their job and simultaneously watching a man hover at the edge of something irreversible. And there was nothing anyone could do about it except the person with his hands inside the chest cavity. I was aware of all of it, aware of the pressure numbers Fiona was calling out, aware of Callum's tension on the other side of the table, aware of the fact that Alistair Kane was somewhere outside that door, waiting on a result I could not promise. And somewhere underneath all of that awareness, like a sound coming through a wall, I could hear Lydia Beaumont's voice from that morning. Not the specific words. I had stopped listening carefully to the specific words somewhere around month 3 of our conflict, but the tone that said I was the problem, that the way I worked, the way I made decisions, the weight I gave to what happened on that table over what appeared on a spreadsheet, that all of it was the problem, that I did not fit. I had spent many years fitting myself to that operating theater, to the particular demands of the moment when a person was losing their grip on being alive, and someone had to be the thing that held. I pushed the voice back and I looked at the field in front of me. The right hepatic vein had a partial laceration, not a full transection. That mattered. A full transection at that location without a full surgical team and a perfusionist and a bypass circuit was not survivable in this room. A partial laceration repaired with precision and speed was a different conversation. I had done it before, once years ago in a county hospital with less equipment and worse lighting, and a patient who had walked out of the ICU 11 days later and sent me a handwritten note I had kept in my desk until that morning. The note was in the cardboard box on Elm Avenue. Now I focused on the vein. The access was terrible. The angle was wrong. I asked for a different needle driver, adjusted my grip, and began the repair with the kind of deliberate steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the refusal to let my hands betray what my mind knew how to do. Systolic is 82, Fiona said. Holding, good. Keep it there. The repair took 9 minutes. 9 minutes of suturing at a depth and angle that should have required a team twice the size in a facility 10 times more equipped. I worked without commentary, without asking for reassurance, without looking at the monitors more than necessary, because looking at the monitors was Fiona's job, and doing my job was my job. I placed the final suture. I checked the line. I irrigated. I looked at the field for a long moment. The bleeding had stopped, not slowed, stopped. Pressure, I said. 89 and climbing, Fiona said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before. Not relief exactly, but the first movement toward it. Heart rate coming down. He is responding. I moved to the diaphragm. The lateral extension of the tear needed to be closed, and I did it methodically, layer by layer, with the same economy I had brought to every other step. The room had changed. Callum had stopped shifting his weight. The second technician, who had not spoken once during the entire procedure, exhaled audibly enough that the sound carried. Fiona ran her numbers quietly and steadily, and the numbers were moving in the right direction. It took another 35 minutes to close. When it was done and the final dressing was placed, and Fiona had confirmed that Langford's vitals were stabilizing into a range that looked for the first time all evening like something a person could sustain, I stepped back from the table. I stripped my outer gloves. I looked at the monitor one more time. Pressure holding, heart rate settling, oxygen saturation recovering. And then I looked at no one in particular and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said inside that room. The result was the statement. I walked to the scrub sink, ran cold water over my hands, and stood there for a moment with my eyes closed and the sound of the monitors bleeding through the door behind me. Outside, I knew Alistair Kane was waiting. Langford's family was probably there by now, or would be soon. There would be questions about next steps, about transfer to a proper facility for continued care, about what happened from here. All of that was real, and all of it would need to be handled. But in that moment, standing at the sink with cold water running over my hands, I was only aware of one thing. Somewhere on Elm Avenue there was a cardboard box sitting on the ground in the dark, and I had left it there without looking back. And somehow, in a way that I could not have anticipated when I set it down, that felt exactly right. Alistair Kane was standing in the hallway when I came through the door. He had his arms crossed and his back against the wall, and the way he straightened when he saw my face told me the man had been doing this long enough to read an outcome before it was spoken. "He is stable," I said. "The hepatic repair held. The diaphragm is closed. His pressure was climbing when I left the room." I kept my voice level the same way I always delivered post-operative status, factual, direct, without the inflation that families sometimes needed and medical colleagues never did. He needs to be transferred to a full trauma center within the next several hours for monitoring and continued care. The repair is solid, but this is not the environment for his recovery. Alistair nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then something in the man's composure shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films. Just a small release of tension around the jaw and eyes that indicated an enormous amount of pressure had just been removed from a very specific point. "I will make the call," he said. "St. George's in London has a trauma unit. We have a relationship there." "Good. Fiona should ride with him. She knows his intraoperative course better than anyone. You would hand him off to cold." "Understood." Alistair looked at me for a moment with a kind of directness that was not quite gratitude yet, because gratitude required time to become fully formed. "Is there anything you need right now?" I thought about it honestly. "A chair?" I said. "And some water." They found me both in a small room off the main corridor, a sitting room that had the feel of a space designed for waiting, with good chairs and low lighting, and a window that looked out onto the dark grounds of the estate. Someone brought water and a plate of food that I did not remember requesting, but ate anyway, because I had been on my feet for the better part of 4 hours, and my body had opinions about that. I sat alone and let the quiet settle around me, which was something I had always been able to do after a surgery. Let the sustained concentration of the operating theater drain out slowly, like water finding its level. I thought about the case with the clinical part of my mind still running, checking and rechecking the decisions I had made. The repair, the approach, the 9 minutes on the hepatic vein. That was normal. That was what you did. You ran it again after the fact, not because you doubted it, but because the discipline of review was what kept the next case cleaner than the last. I found nothing I would change. The conditions had been what they were, and the decisions had been the right ones for those conditions, and Sir Victor Langford was alive because of it. I sat with that for a while, and it felt neither triumphant nor hollow. It felt more than anything like the simple completion of a thing that had needed to be completed. The news moved faster than the helicopter. By the time I had finished eating and the transfer arrangements were being finalized, Langford was moved to St. George's Stable and sedated with Fiona Clark accompanying as agreed. Word had already begun to travel through the particular channels that words travel through when they involve powerful people and unlikely circumstances. By the next morning, the story had a shape that the people telling it found irresistible. The surgeon dismissed that afternoon by his hospital director had been pulled off the street by helicopters and had saved the life of Sir Victor Langford before the day was out. I did not learn most of this from a phone call or a news alert. I learned it the way private information becomes public knowledge, gradually through the reactions of other people. Alistair Kane, who was not given to unnecessary conversation, mentioned at some point that Dr. Fiona Clark had spoken with the receiving team at St. George's and that the case had already generated significant discussion in the trauma surgery community. One of the attending physicians there apparently had recognized the specifics of the repair and described it to a colleague as something he had not seen executed outside a major academic center. By the time I was being driven back toward London in one of Langford's vehicles, my phone had more missed calls on it than it had accumulated in the previous month combined. I did not return any of them that night. I watched the city lights come up through the window and let the phone sit in my pocket, and I thought about the cardboard box. It was still there, presumably, on Elm Avenue. Or it was not because someone had moved it, or the wind had turned it over, or any number of unremarkable things had happened to an unremarkable box sitting on a pavement in the dark. I was not sure why it kept coming back to me, that image of the box on the pavement. Maybe because it was the most honest picture of where I had been 12 hours ago, standing on a public street with everything I had built packed into a container that a person could carry under one arm. I had set it down, I had walked away from it, and I had gone and done the only thing I actually knew how to do. A few days later, Alistair Kane called and asked if I would be willing to meet with Langford's family. Langford himself was still in the ICU at St. George's, improving, the report said, though recovery from that level of injury was measured in weeks and months rather than days. His wife, Lady Beatrice Langford, had been at the hospital since the night of the accident, and it was she who had made the request. The meeting happened in a private lounge on the 4th floor of St. George's, the kind of room that existed for conversations that required privacy and a certain amount of quiet. Lady Beatrice Langford was a composed woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested she had spent a long time learning how to hold herself upright under pressure. She thanked me directly and without ornamentation, which I appreciated because elaborate gratitude always made me uncomfortable. She asked a few questions about the surgery, about what recovery would look like, about what Victor would be able to do and when. I answered them as honestly as I could. Then she told me why she had really asked me to come. She said that her husband over the years had spoken often about the state of emergency medicine in the region, about the gaps, the facilities that were underfunded, the cases that fell through because the right resources were not in the right place. She said that he had considered more than once making a significant investment in building something new, a trauma center built from the ground up with the philosophy that the quality of care should not be determined by a patient's insurance tier or the cost-benefit calculus of a hospital administrator. She said that what had happened a few days ago, the specific nature of it, the fact that the surgeon best equipped to save her husband's life had been removed from his position that same afternoon precisely because he refused to let those calculations govern his decisions, had made the question feel less abstract than it ever had before. "We want to build it," Beatrice said. "A trauma and emergency center properly funded, properly staffed, with the kind of independence that means the people running it make decisions based on medicine." She looked at me steadily. "We want to know if you would lead it." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved at its ordinary pace. Traffic, pedestrians, the indifferent rhythm of a Thursday morning. I thought about the conversation I had had with Lydia Beaumont in that glass-walled office. The folder on the desk, the word conduct used twice. I thought about the form sitting across from me, waiting for a signature I never gave. I thought about the 43-year-old man with the ruptured hepatic artery who had sent me a handwritten note and the note sitting in a cardboard box on Elm Avenue, and whether the box was still there. I thought about what it would mean to build something where the rule I had always operated by, if a person is still breathing when they come through that door, your job is to make sure they keep breathing, was not a source of conflict, but the founding principle. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" I asked. Beatrice Langford allowed herself something close to a smile. "As fast as we can do it properly," she said, which I understand from people who know these things is not as fast as we would like, but faster than you might expect. I nodded. I would need to be involved in the design from the beginning, the operational structure, the staffing philosophy, the protocols, all of it. "That is the only way we would want to do it," she said. I told her I would think about it because that was the honest answer, not because I was uncertain, but because I was someone who did not commit to things in the room before I had given them the weight they deserved. I took the drive home to think, and I thought about it the way I thought about surgical plans, methodically, without sentiment, looking for the flaws in the approach before committing to the approach. I did not find any. A few days after the meeting, I called Alistair Kane and told him yes. Alistair said he had expected that answer and had already told Beatrice as much. I told him not to do that again. And Alistair said he would try. The cardboard box, it turned out, had been found by a Parks Department worker the next morning, sitting undisturbed on the edge of Elm Avenue. The worker, not finding any identification, had brought it to the city's lost and found office where it sat for some time before I retrieved it. The stethoscope was still there. The surgical reference text was still there. The handwritten note from the man with the ruptured hepatic artery was still there, folded to a softness that came from having been opened and reread more times than I would have admitted. I took the box home to the flat on Harrington Street and unpacked it for the last time and put the note somewhere I would not lose it because it belonged to a version of my life I intended to carry forward rather than leave behind. Many years in one institution had taught me to be the best version of myself within a system that had eventually run out of room for what I was. That was not failure, or it was, but it was the kind that clarified rather than diminished. Lydia Beaumont had looked at me across a desk and told me I did not fit. And she had been right in the only way that mattered. I did not fit inside a structure that weighed a human life against a ledger entry and called that medicine. What she had not understood, what the termination agreement and the prepared folder and the measured tone had not accounted for, was that not fitting was not the same as not belonging. I belonged exactly where my training and my instincts and my many years of refusing to let a person die when I could prevent it had always been pointing me. Somewhere in the city, in a building that did not yet exist, there were people who would come through a door in the worst moments of their lives. They would not know my name. They would not know what had happened on that afternoon on Elm Avenue or what a cardboard box had to do with any of it. They would only know that someone met them in that doorway and that the only question that mattered was the one I had been answering my whole career. What do you need? And how do we keep you alive? As I stood there that afternoon on Elm Avenue, cardboard box under my arm, and the last traces of Riverside General fading behind me, I realized something that still catches in my throat whenever I think of it. Belonging is not the same as fitting in. I had spent years inside those walls, hands deep in chests that refused to stop beating, guided by one simple truth. If someone came through that door still breathing, my job was to keep them that way. Yet the moment I refused to let spreadsheets decide who lived and who did not, the system spat me out. I felt utterly lost, carrying nothing but a stethoscope and a faded note from a man whose life I had once saved against every rule. Then 3 black helicopters shattered the quiet sky above that empty field, and Alistair Kane's urgent grip pulled me towards something far bigger than my own bruised pride. In that private surgical suite on the Surrey estate, with Sir Victor Langford's life slipping away beneath my fingers, I understood at last the right path does not always look like success. It sometimes begins the very moment you are told you no longer belong. True purpose finds you when you stay loyal to what you know is right, even when it costs everything you have built. That cardboard box still sits in my flat on Harrington Street, a quiet reminder that letting go can be the bravest step toward where you were always meant to stand. If my story has stirred something deep inside you, the fire to hold your ground when the world demands you bend, please share in the comments below. What principle have you refused to surrender, no matter the price? And if these tales of quiet courage move you, do hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another. Your support truly keeps this channel alive. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.